lights are blinding, the studio humming with that peculiar stillness that comes right before a storm. Alan Dershowitz leans back in his chair, a faint smile cutting across his face, the smile of a man too used to hearing himself win. His tone is razor sharp, the kind that sounds like intellect but feels like insult. "Congresswoman," he begins, voice dipped in polite disdain. "Some of us have spent decades studying the law before turning it into performance art." The panel chuckles softly, uncertain whether to laugh or brace for impact. Jasmine Crockett doesn't flinch. The audience feels it, that chill of arrogance disguised as civility. He keeps going, each sentence dripping with the confidence of a man who believes he owns the room. "I understand passion," he says, "but passion isn't jurisprudence. Let's not confuse courtroom theatrics with constitutional literacy." His words slice through the air, designed to sound like mentorship, delivered like mockery. Somewhere a producer smiles, knowing this will trend before the hour ends. Crockett's eyes narrow, but her posture stays still, deliberate. Her hands fold calmly on the desk, not clenched, not shaking, waiting. She lets him finish his monologue, every syllable echoing across social feeds in real time. The camera cuts to her face, and in that moment, every viewer knows something irreversible is about to unfold. Dershowitz leans closer, too confident to notice the silence building around him. "Of course," he says with that final smirk. "Some people mistake activism for lawmaking. That's the problem when emotion enters governance." The line lands like a slap. Gasps ripple through the audience. The moderator shifts uneasily, even through the polished smiles of the other guests. Discomfort glimmers. But Crockett doesn't blink. She exhales once, the kind of breath that carries centuries of being underestimated. The air thickens. She tilts her head, that calm half, smile breaking through like a warning flare. The nation is about to witness something unforgettable, and for the first time, Dershowitz seems to sense it. The sound fades into silence. The lights sharpen. Millions lean forward, phones raised, hearts beating in collective anticipation. But what Jasmine did next silenced every critic who ever underestimated her. It didn't start in that studio. It started months earlier when the country found itself arguing not over policy, but over truth itself. Every channel, every feed, every podcast became a battlefield where facts bent under the weight of opinion. People weren't asking what happened anymore. They were asking, who do I believe? And into that fog stepped Jasmine Crockett, a first-term Congresswoman who refused to treat politics like theater. Her voice cracked through the noise, sharp, unpolished, unafraid. She didn't come from think tanks or Ivy League classrooms. She came from courtrooms that smelled like sweat and fear, where justice wasn't a debate topic, it was a lifeline. Her rise unsettled the establishment. In every committee hearing, every viral clip, she turned quiet moments into moral mirrors. And on the other side stood Alan Dershowitz, the embodiment of the old order. Brilliant, quotable, impossible to ignore. For decades, he'd been the face of televised intellect, the man networks called when they needed gravity, wrapped in argument. But gravity can harden into arrogance. His eloquence, once admired, now often felt like a weapon pointed at anyone who dared to speak from the gut instead of the book. Producers knew what they were doing when they booked them on the same panel. It wasn't just ratings, it was ritual. The professor versus the congresswoman, the patriarch of reason versus the firebrand of conviction. Two Americas colliding under bright lights. To the audience, it was entertainment. To millions watching from living rooms and phones, it was validation versus dismissal. Every dinner table argument about who gets to define smart, qualified, or American enough made flesh. Behind the scenes, staff whispered about how it might go. She's good. One intern said, eyes glued to the prep notes. But he's Dershowitz. The older producers nodded. They'd seen his kind of confidence before. The kind that fed off interruption, off underestimation. What they hadn't seen was someone like Jasmine, who could turn silence into strategy, who understood that you don't fight arrogance with volume, you let it echo until it collapses on itself. The nation was already tense. Every conversation about justice or rights bled into identity. And every identity became a trigger. Crockett represented something raw. A generation tired of explaining its worth. She wasn't supposed to be there, not in that seat, not with that R.A. Sommet. Yet there she was, holding her own beside a man who'd lectured presidents and sparred with anchors since before she finished high school. The imbalance was glaring, and that was the point. This wasn't just a TV debate. It was a stage where America's cultural tension found a voice. Dershowitz's role wasn't to win. It was to remind viewers what the old guard still believed. That experience equaled entitlement. That intellect came with hierarchy. Crockett's role wasn't to argue. It was to prove that authenticity could dismantle authority. When the red light blinked on and the host introduced them, the world saw two figures seated inches apart yet separated by eras. Dershowitz adjusted his tie. The gesture of a man preparing to perform. Crockett straightened her posture. The stillness of someone ready to endure. What followed would become the kind of exchange historians replay in classrooms. Not for what was said, but for what it revealed about the time in which it was spoken. And though the audience couldn't sense it yet, and the temperature in that room was already rising, the balance tilting, the narrative about to flip. But beneath the calm surface of that studio, a storm was brewing. And it was about to erupt live on air. For half a century, Alan Dershowitz has been a fixture in American debate. A man whose name alone carries the weight of legal theater. His voice, deep and deliberate, can still silence a room. Once, that voice defended the powerless. Now it defends itself. His reputation stretches from Harvard's lecture halls to the bright glare of cable news studios, where he perfected the art of turning moral chaos into intellectual order. He doesn't shout. He dissects. And that's what makes him dangerous. On television, Dershowitz speaks like someone explaining the universe to children. His tone is patient, indulgent, as though disagreement is merely the product of inferior reasoning. He interrupts without seeming rude, corrects without raising his voice, and always closes his sentences like final judgments. Clips of him debating young activists circulate online, his eyes narrowing, his smirk almost paternal. He says things like, "You're passionate, but passion doesn't equal perspective." Or, "I've argued before real judges, not social media." The crowd laughs, and somewhere behind the glass, a producer counts the views already climbing. To the casual viewer, he's the consummate intellect, well-read, articulate, precise. But to those who listen closely, There's a performance running beneath the logic, an addiction to authority. Every correction, every rhetorical trap is another brick in the empire of his self-certainty. He isn't trying to persuade, he's trying to preserve. Because for men like Dershowitz, argument isn't conversation, it's oxygen. And as the world changes around him, he's gasping to prove that his voice still matters. Behind closed doors, colleagues describe him as relentless. He never concedes. One former student once whispered, even when he's wrong. Especially when he's wrong. In faculty lounges, he'd provoke debate just to remind the room he could still win it. The irony is tragic. The more he insisted on his brilliance, the more irrelevant he became to a generation that measures truth not by pedigree, but by lived experience. Still, the old reflexes never left him. On panels, when younger, more diverse guests speak, his hands twitch. His head tilts, searching for openings to interject. He can't help himself. Authority demands to be reasserted. When Jasmine Crockett's name first appeared on the guest list for that night's show, he reportedly smiled. "This will be easy," he told a producer. "She's emotional. I'm logical." It wasn't arrogance in his mind. It was natural order. Yet arrogance has a way of aging poorly. What once read as confidence now feels like condescension. When he defends positions that twist morality into hypotheticals, audiences don't see nuance anymore, they see evasion. He calls it intellectual integrity. They call it spin. The gap between his intent and their interpretation widens with every broadcast, and still he can't see it. To him, misunderstanding only proves that others aren't thinking deeply enough. The montage writes itself. Dershowitz leaning over microphones, lecturing women half his age about, his hand slicing the air as he says, "Let's not get emotional." His half laugh when challenged, "You're missing the legal nuance." In his world, being right is less about truth and more about dominance. And in that, he's not so different from the systems he once claimed to critique. Rigid, self-justifying, allergic to accountability. The brilliance remains undeniable. The mind is still sharp, the recall encyclopedic. But somewhere along the line, the purpose blurred, the law became language, and language became power. When he talks, it's as if the world must slow down and make room for his logic. But the world no longer waits. The rhythm of conversation has shifted. Faster, rawer, more human. And in that new rhythm, Dershowitz sounds like an echo of a time when intellect meant exclusion. That night in the studio, sitting across from Jasmine Crockett, he felt the old thrill return. The lights, the debate, the promise of a televised victory. He adjusted his tie, eyes glinting with the confidence of a man, convinced he was about to deliver another masterclass. He'd done this 1,000 times, dismantled opponents, dazzled audiences, proven his supremacy with a smirk and a well-timed metaphor. But he didn't see what everyone else did. And he didn't see that the audience no longer cheered for lectures. They cheered for authenticity. He didn't sense that his calm superiority, once magnetic, now felt outdated. While he was busy crafting perfect arguments, people had stopped asking for perfection. They were asking for truth. And as he cleared his throat to deliver yet another condescending line, a quiet irony unfolded. The professor who built his life on exposing contradictions was about to become one. He thought he was schooling a rookie, but this rookie had receipts. and a voice that would change everything long before the cameras, before the bright lights and talking heads. Jasmine Crockett learned how to stand her ground in rooms that weren't built for her. She was raised in the heart of Texas, in neighborhoods where ambition wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Her parents taught her that dignity wasn't something the world handed out. It was something you carried, even when no one else saw it. While other kids were memorizing fairy tales, she was watching the quiet heroism of people who worked twice as hard to get half as far and still smiled while doing it. In high school, she was the student teachers remembered not for being loud, but for refusing to let injustice slide. When a classmate was suspended unfairly, she wrote a letter that made its way to the principal's desk. It wasn't fiery or emotional, it was precise, factual, and impossible to ignore. That was the beginning of a pattern. The calm fury of someone who believed in fairness more than applause. College came next, and the pattern sharpened into purpose. While many chased prestige, Jasmine chased proof that the system could still serve the people it often forgot. Law school wasn't just another credential, it was her rebellion against the quiet assumption that justice had a price tag. She didn't intern at high-rise firms or seek mentors in marble offices. She chose public defense, the place where stories of the unseen stacked up like files in metal cabinets. And every case was a life on the brink. In those dim courtrooms, she learned to read silence the way others read statutes. She learned that when the law turns its back on people, it's not because the law failed. It's because people with power stopped listening. She listened. She fought. She lost some cases she should have won, and those losses carved her into something unbreakable. By the time she ran for office, she wasn't doing it to be seen. She was doing it so others could be heard. Her campaign didn't have corporate sponsors or national endorsements. It had volunteers, churchgoers, and the kind of voters who'd long stopped believing politicians could sound like them. Jasmine showed up to barbershops, school gyms, and parking lots. She spoke in plain sentences, not rehearsed rhetoric. When a reporter once asked how she planned to win against the machine, she smiled. Machines don't vote. People do. In Congress, her style didn't change. She still spoke like someone who knew the cost of being ignored. On camera, her voice carried the edge of every courtroom where she'd stood between poverty and prosecution. She didn't crave controversy, but she didn't fear it either. When she called out hypocrisy, she did it with surgical calm, not the theatrics of outrage, but the authority of truth. Every viral clip told the same story: the woman who refused to shrink, the woman who smiled when interrupted, then dismantled the interruption with a single line. She became the symbol of a new kind of power, not inherited, but earned, not loud, but lasting. Viewers saw themselves in her, the immigrant daughter, the working mother, the quiet employee in meetings where voices like hers were always cut short. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just speaking for them. She was proving they'd been right all along. That intelligence doesn't need permission to exist. Even her critics couldn't deny it. Behind the smirks and dismissals, there was a grudging respect. Her confidence wasn't performance. It was survival turned into art. She didn't need to shout to command attention. Her calm was the shout. That's what made her dangerous and unforgettable. So, when she walked into that studio to face Alan Dershowitz, she wasn't walking into an ambush. She was walking into another courtroom, one without walls, where the jury was the nation itself. The same instinct that had guided her from Texas classrooms to congressional hearings now steadied her heartbeat under those harsh studio lights. As the makeup artist dabbed her cheek and the producer counted down from 5, she wasn't rehearsing comebacks. She was remembering every face that ever told her, "You don't belong here." And like every time before, she smiled, not to disarm, but to declare. And as the cameras rolled, that very fire, calm, measured, and unflinching, was about to ignite the moment America didn't see coming. The first question seems harmless, a polite and neutral inquiry about civility in modern politics. But even before Jasmine finishes her first sentence, Dershowitz cuts in. With all due respect, he says the phrase that always means the opposite. "You're conflating emotion with evidence again. This isn't about feelings, Congresswoman. It's about facts." The studio audience shifts. Crockett doesn't move. Her chin stays level, her voice steady. "I agree," she says. "Facts matter, especially the ones people like to ignore." He smiles, almost pitying. That's a clever soundbite. But governance isn't about cleverness. It's about comprehension. His tone drips with the kind of patronizing charm that once passed for intellect. He adjusts his cufflink as if to signal the end of her turn, but she doesn't yield. She leans forward slightly, the posture of someone who's been interrupted too many times to care anymore. "Comprehension," she repeats softly, "isn't your monopoly, Professor. And passion doesn't cancel logic, it gives it purpose." The moderator glances between them, torn between control and curiosity. The audience murmurs, a ripple of anticipation. Dershowitz's eyes sharpen. He senses he's losing rhythm, purpose. He says, laughing under his breath, "Is a word politicians use when they don't have policy." Crockett doesn't take the bait. "Policy without purpose," she replies, "is how we end up debating humanity like it's a hypothetical. You've made a career out of treating morality as a math problem. Some of us live the equation. That lands." The audience inhales collectively. Dershowitz blinks, his smile freezing for a fraction too long. "That's poetic," he says finally, "but not persuasive. You don't get to define persuasive." She answers, "Not anymore." The moderator tries to redirect. "Let's keep this civil." But civility is already gone. This is something deeper, older, and everyone watching knows it. The split screen captures their faces, his eyes calculating, hers unwavering. It's not volume that holds the room, it's conviction. He pivots, reaching for control. "Congresswoman, when I was teaching constitutional law, we valued precedent. You seem to value performance." "Performance," she repeats. "You mean when a woman raises her voice and suddenly it's theater?" Her tone doesn't rise, it deepens. "You built a legacy on defending the indefensible and calling it principle. I built mine on standing up for people who can't afford your kind of principle." The words slice through the air. No yelling, no gesturing, just precision. Even the cameras seem to hesitate, unsure where to focus. Dershowitz laughs, but the sound doesn't reach his eyes. "That's rich," he says. "You think one term in Congress and a few viral clips make you an expert in justice?" Crockett tilts her head, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. No, she says. Experience makes me an expert in justice. And experience doesn't always come with tenure. The line detonates, gasps, applause. Even the moderator can't hide the flicker of awe. Dershowitz's face flushes, his practiced composure fraying at the edges. Well, he says, trying to recover. If we're trading slogans, I suppose nuance is dead. Crockett's response is immediate and surgical. Nuance isn't dead, she says. It's just tired of being your excuse. That's when the tone shifts. What began as sparring now feels like reckoning. Every sentence exposes a fracture between generations, between intellect and empathy, between those who argue about justice and those who live it. Crockett doesn't gloat. She doesn't even look triumphant. She just looks done. Done apologizing for her presence, done debating her legitimacy. Across from her, Howitzer straightens his notes, pretending composure. But his fingers betray him, tapping, restless, defensive. He searches for a final angle, a way to restore the hierarchy he's always commanded. The camera zooms in. His eyes flick to hers. She meets his gaze, calm as still water. And for the first time, it's clear who owns the room. But the moment he tried to corner her with one final insult, Jasmine turned the tables. Live, uncut, and devastating. The silence after his last interruption feels thick enough to touch. Even the hum of the studio lights seems to fade. Howitzer adjusts his tie, smirking just enough to suggest he thinks he's regained command. Congresswoman, he says, voice dripping with the calm superiority of someone whose certain history bends toward his kind of intellect. It's admirable that you're passionate, but passion doesn't rewrite law. And it certainly doesn't make you right. Crockett doesn't flinch. Her hands rest on the desk, fingers still, eyes locked on him. The camera's close in. One tight shot on her expression, one on his. The split screen turns the air electric. Then she exhales, low and deliberate. The sound of composure crystallizing into something sharper. Professor, she says evenly, passion built this country. Passion tore down slavery, forced open ballot boxes, and demanded the Constitution live up to its own words. The problem isn't that I'm passionate. The problem is that you've mistaken comfort for correctness. A murmur ripples through the audience. Horowitz's brow tightens, a twitch just beneath the surface. He starts to reply, but she keeps going, measured, unstoppable. You say I'm emotional, but what you really mean is I'm not deferential. You say I don't understand the law, but what you really mean is I won't let it be used as a shield for hypocrisy. You talk about precedent as if injustice should get seniority. That's not intellect, Professor. That's ego dressed as ethics. Gasps echo. One audience member mouths, "Oh my God." The moderator glances toward the control booth. Do they cut to break? No one moves. Howitzer blinks, clearly unprepared for how calm she still is. I think you're misunderstanding. No. She cuts in, her voice low but resonant. I think you're underestimating. The heartbeat sound of the studio make catches. A faint bass under her words. It's not sound design, it's collective adrenaline. You see, she continues, for decades, people like you have sat in rooms like this, deciding who gets to be credible. You write the narrative, you quote the footnotes, you play God with context. But you never have to live with the consequences. I do. My community does. The people you debate like abstractions. They live what you theorize. The tension coils tighter. Howitzer opens his mouth, but nothing comes. She keeps going, voice unwavering. You call it intellectual rigor. I call it selective morality. You defend principles until they're inconvenient. You praise democracy until it demands you share the mic. And when a woman stands her ground, especially a black woman, suddenly it's emotional. Suddenly it's uniformed. Her words hang like thunder before lightning. I read your books, Professor, she adds, almost softly now. You once wrote that truth is a defense. I agree. But truth isn't your private property. And tonight, it's on the record. The audience bursts, not in cheers. Not yet, but in that hushed awe that happens when something bigger than the debate just happened. Howitzer, visibly rattled, shifts in his chair. You're grandstanding, he mutters. Crockett tilts her head. No, I'm testifying. The camera cuts to the moderator, frozen mid-breath. Then back to her. She leans in slightly, her tone softer, sharper, cutting through the air like a blade made of glass. You ask why young people don't trust voices like yours anymore, she says. Because you confuse access with wisdom. Because you think being the loudest makes you the most right. But here's the truth.
Professor, America's not buying it anymore. You've spent decades defending the powerful and calling it balance.
Meanwhile, the rest of us have learned to see the bias hiding behind your brilliance. Now the silence shifts. It's no longer anticipation, it's revelation. Every face in the studio reflects it, the intern behind the camera, the audience member clutching her chest, the producer whispering, keep rolling. Crockett's voice lowers again, not angry, but certain. You once said justice is blind, she continues. But what you never said is that it's also selective, depending on who's holding the scale. And when the law becomes a game of who can argue best instead of who can live free, that's not justice. That's performance. That's your show. Her eyes hold his. He looks away just for a second. The briefest, smallest tell. Then she lands the line that will echo across screens before midnight. That's why you're losing America. The words detonate in the silence. No shouting, no music. Just the echo. It's the stillness that follows, that seals it. The audience stunned, the moderator speechless. Howitzer frozen with his mouth half open. The camera zooms slowly on her face, calm, resolute, eyes glinting not with victory, but with truth recognized. A beat passes. 2. Then someone in the back claps once. Another joins. Then the sound builds. Hesitant at first, then unstoppable. In that moment, the studio transforms. It isn't applause for spectacle. It's a collective exhale. It's generations hearing themselves defended. Howitzer swallows hard, forced to respond. Congresswoman, with all due respect. She interrupts, not out of aggression, but authority. Respect isn't a phrase you say before an insult, she says quietly. It's how you choose to listen when the world shifts without your permission. The moderator tries to pivot. We need to go to commercial, but it's too late. The moment's alive, clips already queued in millions of minds. Phones raised, fingers hovering over record buttons. Crockett glances briefly toward the audience, then back to him. This isn't about you or me, she says. It's about every person who's been talked over, dismissed, or told they're too much. You built a legacy on winning arguments. Some of us are here to win change. And with that, she stops. No flourish, no grin. Just silence, the kind that humbles even arrogance. Howitzer opens his mouth once more, searching for words. None come. The moderator finally whispers, "We'll be right back," but it barely registers. The cameras linger on her as the studio fades to commercial, eyes forward, posture calm, history humming under her breath. By the time the network cuts to black, Twitter has already exploded. That's why you're losing America. Trends at #1. TikTok clips loop with captions, like when truth hits harder than a gavel. News anchors replay the exchange frame by frame, dissecting tone, expression, timing. But those who were watching live, they remember something else. The heartbeat, the hush, the way power shifted in real time. Because sometimes revolution doesn't roar. Sometimes it just looks straight into the camera and speaks softly enough for the world to finally listen. But what happened in the hours after that viral moment showed just how powerful truth can be when spoken without fear. By midnight, the internet has become an electric current of disbelief, pride, and poetic justice. Clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown loop endlessly across every platform, different angles, captions, slow motion replays of that final line. That's why you're losing America. Within hours, the hashtag #FecCrockett Clapback climbs to the #1 trending spot worldwide. Beneath it, face speechless, fame authoritative. And Fi retrospective swarm the feeds like a digital standing ovation. TikTok remixes turn the moment into a movement. One edit overlays her quote with swelling orchestral music. Another cuts between her calm expression and Horowitz's stunned silence in rhythmic, cinematic beats. High school students in debate clubs lip sync her words as if reciting from scripture. College professors played the clip in classes about rhetoric and representation. A young woman in Detroit posts a video, eyes glistening, whispering. That's exactly how it feels when they talk over you, and you decide you're done being small. Late night talk show hosts can't resist. Alan Howitzer got thunder shower, one joke's earning a roar from the crowd. Another says, this wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. But beyond the laughter lies something deeper. For once, the punchline isn't the woman holding her ground. It's the man who underestimated her. Cable news picks it up next. Split screens again. This time, pundits dissecting tone and meaning, comparing Crockett's precision to Obama's cadence and her composure to Angela Davis's poise. One conservative commentator admits on air, she handled that with grace. You can't coach that kind of composure. For a moment, even the usual cynics pause. The airwaves, normally cluttered with noise, are suddenly unified in acknowledgement something rare just happened. In community centers, classrooms, and coffee shops, people replay the clip not to analyze it, but to feel it, to watch someone embody what restraint looks like when the world expects rage. Mothers send it to daughters. Daughters send it to friends. Men, young, old, skeptical, share it with a quiet caption. Watch this. And it's not just domestic. International outlets pick it up. The BBC calls it a viral masterclass in composure. Al Grazer runs a headline reading, the Congresswoman who redefined respect. Commentators in India, South Africa, and Brazil echo the sentiment, the universality of dignity cutting across borders and accents. Then come the memes. Someone edits a mock courtroom poster, Crockett v. Ego case closed. Another turns her quote into street art. A stencil of her face under the words, "Truth doesn't shout, it stands." Within days, that mural appears in Houston, Chicago, and Atlanta. And yet, the magic isn't just in the vitality, it's in the validation. For every retweet and repose, there's a story beneath it, a woman in corporate America saying, "She spoke for me." A law student writing, "She's why I applied." A mother of 3 whispering during a night shift. Finally, someone didn't let them talk her down. Even in Congress, the ripple is felt. A handful of representatives, both sides of the aisle, reference the exchange. Why need more Jasmine Crockett? One says, not because she's loud, but because she's clear. Within 24 hours, hashtags evolve into headlines, headlines into think pieces. The Atlantic publishes The Anatomy of a Modern Mic Drop. Vogue calls her the face of fearless femininity. An op-ed in the Washington Post reads, "When truth outsmarts power, but beyond the words and pixels, something intangible shifts. You can feel it in the tone of the discourse, an invisible recalibration of who gets to command the room." Suddenly, the archetype of authority looks different. Authority doesn't wear gray suits and decades of tenure. It wears confidence earned in the fire of being dismissed and daring to speak anyway. At a small rally in Dallas a week later, Jasmine walks onto a stage to address community organizers. Before she even reaches the microphone, the crowd chants, "That's why you're losing America." It's not mockery, it's anthem. She laughs, waves her hands, tries to calm them, but they keep going. The words have become shorthand for standing tall in the face of arrogance. Meanwhile, Howitzer remains mostly silent. A brief statement on cable. "I respect the Congresswoman's passion." But online, the clips tell a different story. His face frozen mid-reaction, an icon of the moment power shifted live on air. And across the internet, creators dissect not just what happened, but why it resonated. It wasn't just her words. One says on a viral breakdown, it was her stillness. That revolution, the refusal to be rattled. The deeper truth beneath the frenzy becomes clear. And people weren't cheering because she won an argument. They were cheering that because she embodied what millions have felt. That dignity can dismantle dominance. That poise can pierce arrogance. That truth doesn't need to shout to shake a nation awake. By week's end, millions have watched, reposed, written, painted, debated. A phrase from a live interview becomes a cultural touchstone, not just for politics, but for presence. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remains composed, her silence now as loud as her words once were. Every post, every headline, every remix is an echo of the same heartbeat that filled that studio. But the real twist wasn't online. It was what Jasmine said next that made this moment more than a viral clip. In the days that followed, the noise began to quiet, but Jasmine Crockett's voice lingered. The viral moment had already cemented itself in the nation's consciousness, yet she refused to let it be reduced to a soundbite. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't on a debate stage or in a combative interview. It was in a quiet, reflective sit down on a Sunday morning show, sunlight filtering through the studio glass, her tone calm, measured, human. The host began cautiously, "Congresswoman, people are calling it the Crockett Clapback. How do you see it?" Jasmine smiled, not with triumph, but with clarity. It wasn't a clapback, she said softly. It was a conversation that finally had balance. I wasn't there to humiliate anyone. I was there to remind us that dignity doesn't have to yell to be heard. That sentence alone reshaped the narrative. Clips of her words spread again, but this time they carried a quieter power, less fire, more light. Students underlined her phrasing in captions. Commentators replayed it not for drama, but for meaning. I think we confuse anger with strength, she continued. But strength is standing in truth, even when the room doesn't want to hear it. That's what my mother taught me. That's what my faith taught me. And that's what I'll keep doing. The host nodded, visibly moved. Across the screen, an image flashed, her still shot beside Horowitz's from that fateful night, her posture upright, eyes steady, his gaze downward, lips pressed tight, a quiet contrast. Not victory versus defeat, evolution versus erosion. And that's how the public began to see it. Howitzer, once untouchable, appeared suddenly outdated, a relic of an era when power was measured in volume, not virtue. Meanwhile, Jasmine's composure became its own brand of strength, the kind that doesn't demand validation because it defines it. Late night hosts who once joked about the exchange began quoting her instead. Dignity doesn't have to yell. One repeated on air. That line's going to outlive the clip. Even critics found themselves acknowledging something undeniable. She'd changed the tone of discourse without shouting anyone down. It was as if America had been reminded that respect, when wielded fearlessly, can be revolutionary. In interviews and town halls, she spoke about it less as a personal triumph and more as a collective lesson. Every time someone underestimates you, she said at a rally in Houston, you have two choices, shrink or stand. I chose to stand. Because if you let arrogance define you, you lose the very thing that makes you powerful. Your peace. The crowd didn't erupt in noise. They rose in applause, slow and unified. It wasn't the roar of entertainment. It was the hum of awakening. Even the press began framing the story differently. Not Crockett destroys Howitzer, but Crockett redefines power. Analysts pointed out how she transformed conflict into conversation, argument into affirmation. The word grace began trending alongside her name. Somewhere in a Harvard lecture hall, a professor replayed the moment for a class on rhetoric, noting how composure had dismantled centuries of performance politics. That, he told his students, is how truth endures. Through it all, Jasmine stayed consistent, humble, focused. I'm not here to win moments, she said in one speech. I'm here to build movements. Her rise wasn't meteoric. It was magnetic. Each new appearance drew more attention, not because of spectacle, but because of sincerity. She became a mirror for what people wanted leadership to feel like again. Not polished, not perfect, but principled. And as for Howitzer, his silence became its own story. Once the master of rebuttal, he declined interviews, offered no follow-up commentary. The world had moved on, and for the first time, his voice wasn't the loudest in the room. When Jasmine was asked what she thought about that silence, she smiled again. That same unflinching calm. Sometimes silence is just humility learning its lesson, she said. It wasn't a jab. It was grace in motion. The final shot of her interview became the symbol of a new era. Jasmine Crockett, centered in frame, eyes forward, voice steady, A woman who refused to trade composure for applause, who proved that truth doesn't just win arguments, it restores faith. And just when the dust settled, her final words turned the entire debate into a national mirror. Alan Howitzer mocked her and paid for it in silence. What began as another televised clash became something larger, something unmistakably human. Millions watched as arrogance met authenticity and lost. Not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through stillness. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself that night. She defended every person who's ever been spoken over, dismissed, or told they didn't belong at the table. Her power wasn't volume, it was vision. Her calm wasn't weakness. It was mastery, because when you stand in truth, even silence bows its head. Howitzer walked into that studio thinking he was untouchable. He walked out reminded that the world is changing and that the next generation of leadership doesn't need permission to speak. The story wasn't about humiliation, it was about revelation. It proved that dignity, when wielded without fear, is still the most unstoppable force in public life. That integrity can be louder than ego. That grace, in the right hands, can rewrite the definition of power. And as the lights faded and the cameras stopped rolling, one truth lingered. Never mistake kindness for weakness, and never confuse composure for submission. Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest truth. If you believe dignity should never be underestimated, share this story. Share it for every person who's ever been silenced. Share it because voices like Jasmine Crockett's don't just defend truth, they redefine it. Because in the end, history doesn't remember who shouted the loudest. It remembers who stood tallest.